The Pittsburgh Steelers are 10-0. That's right. The Pittsburgh Steelers are 10-0. It sounds almost astonishing and unbelievable to say. And for the first time in the illustrious history of the Pittsburgh Steelers franchise, a franchise that goes back a long time, a franchise that had many down years before the 1970s and that boom with the Steel Curtain and that dynasty, but certainly since then has had a lot of success with a lot of great teams. We know the number of Lombardi trophies, the number of Hall of Famers, the number of winning seasons. Certainly a franchise that has had tons of success and tons of winning seasons under this current regime, under Kevin Colbert and Mike Tomlin, and a Pittsburgh Steelers franchise that has never before finished 10 or started 10-0, and we'll see how they finish this season. I'm your host here, Mike Asti, as always, on this Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on, of course, Pittsburgh Sports Live and Steelers Now. And that's right, the Pittsburgh Steelers have started this season 10-0, a 27-3 victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars leads the Steelers to this 10-0 record. Obviously, that's going to be a focus of this show, but we're also going to talk about a preview and what's to come. A short week now for the Steelers. Hopefully, COVID cooperates because that's always been an issue. That's been one of the tougher opponents for the Steelers this year is the global pandemic of COVID-19. But the 10-0 Pittsburgh Steelers will now go back home and face the Baltimore Ravens, a major game, obviously, for the division, a really must-win game for the Baltimore Ravens, sitting now at 10-0, 27-3 over the now 1-9 Jacksonville Jaguars down there in North Florida. And I will keep my takes on whether Jacksonville should even have an NFL franchise and whether or not they should relocate themselves to London and the viability of London having an NFL franchise to myself. They'll just be over on Twitter for you. But I now will be joined by a man who was on this post-game show in the past. So Daniel Valente had him on a few weeks ago. Certainly the Steelers undefeated at that point, but now it's gearing up to even be more of a conversation of the Steelers being among the NFL elite teams, because at that point it was a question mark. At that point it was a conversation where they fall. And right now this team is undefeated, the only undefeated team in the NFL, and 10-0 for the first time in franchise history, which is still just amazing to say. So Daniel Valente of The Score now joins me here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame. Daniel, happy to have you back. Thanks for joining me yet again. I like the little rustic background you got there. Improved from the past.
I got the lights on this time.
Yeah, I think we got a better visual this time for sure here as I got my home studio going on. I was at the stadium last week, but here back at the home studio. Well, I'm having to quarantine myself. The Steelers are on the road, and we'll see if I can get to Heinz Field on Thursday, but they're going to be there nonetheless. So I'll get us started with this. I mean, how can you, I guess, take this game? Because obviously it's a 1-9 team. It's a team that's been very down. It's a team filled with rookies, a team that dealt with injuries even in this game, a team facing a Steelers defense that continues their sack streak. That's going to be a problem for rookie quarterbacks and young quarterbacks, and we've seen that even this year before this week. But the Steelers take care of business, and now they look ahead. They were not trapped, I guess you could say, by the quintessential trap game that could have existed and was the conversation going into this week. But they sit at 10-0. What are your thoughts right now after a win against a bad team and going into a big game against the Ravens?
I think this is like everyone's dream, really. You know, everyone always speaks about the whole trap game narrative. And so the Steelers went into Jacksonville, a place where they have struggled in the past, even when Jacksonville was bad in the past, and they took care of business. And Jacksonville, I believe they got on the board first, and then Pittsburgh slapped on 27 unanswered, and just completely, this game was out of reach right from the start. And that's exactly what you should expect, and that's exactly what they did. They made Jake Ludon's day a living nightmare, and the defense took care of their job. The offense, even though they won by 24, it felt like, you know, there was still more left in the tank. And I think heading into Thursday, the arrow is pointed up on this team.
To say the least. Yeah, the arrow's been pointed up all year for the Pittsburgh Steelers as they currently sit at 10-0. And as been discussed all year, and it's true, this might be the worst NFL team to start 8-0, 9-0, now 10-0 ever. But none of that really matters for this year. I'm sure that's what Mike Tomlin's going to say, and he is saying right now on his Zoom post game. This team sits at 10-0. Yes, they let Denver get too close earlier in the season with a third stringer. Yes, they let Philadelphia hang around with a banged up crew. They played awful against the Dallas Cowboys for as bad as Dallas has been this year and as banged up as they are without their stars. And they didn't even really play well against the Ravens, which we'll get to in a second in their prior meeting. But unlike past years, forget the franchise history and how amazing it is to be 10-0 right now, but even in recent memory under Mike Tomlin, and I don't even mean the drama years and the injury-ridden years of last year. I mean years with quality teams and contending teams and teams with maybe better rosters than we're even seeing this year. They would occasionally lay eggs against teams that they should otherwise take care of pretty easily. But none of that's happening this year. They're getting wins, even when they're not playing really, really well. They're finding luck in games that maybe they wouldn't have found in past years. So that's really the amazing thing. That's why this team does feel special and feels like destined for greatness. And that's why it's the most important thing to be 10-0, which is why the Steelers right now are 10-0. I do want to stick on this game for a second, because even though it's one of those games you just kind of easily run through, I do kind of want to ask you about why maybe you thought the Steelers' offense started slow in this game. This has been an offense that scored at least 24 points in every game this year. That does continue today, but only 27. It's a less successful day for the offense than in recent games, even in games they struggled in. Ben coming off of an historic game that many argued was one of his best statistical games of his career, as amazing as that sounds, and then not following it up with as great of a game today, missing some throws, almost throwing some picks that maybe should have actually been turnovers that he got lucky on. Why do you think the offense maybe had a little bit more trouble in this game, at least early on?
As for that, I'm not sure, but if it's troubling because if you look back, it seems to start to become a pattern where same thing against Dallas, they start off slow. Against Baltimore, they start off slow, and then eventually they find their groove. Even though today wasn't as efficient as those games, eventually they find the groove, they get going. And I think it's just, maybe more no huddle early they need or something along those lines, just to get the foot on the gas and set that tempo right from the start.
Yeah, and the Steelers, again, put up the points. Ben Roethlisberger finishes this game where it's not like it was a bad day. 32 for 46, almost 70% completing his passes again. 267, 2 TDs, 1 pick that could have been 2, and a quarterback rating of 89.7, so almost 90. I also want to turn the attention to Deontay Johnson and the pecking order of wide receivers, because it doesn't really matter, and this has been discussed on our past shows in the past. It seems like Ben's just finding the open man. He's taking care of whoever takes care of him in terms of who gets open on the play. This is a young group of receivers. There's no Antonio Brown yelling that I got to get my numbers or we're all going to have problems. Ben's able to be the Chris Paul point guard for this team. And from speaking to Ben and just hearing him on the Zooms, he loves this. This feels like maybe one of the more fun seasons of Ben's career, no matter how it finishes. But Deontay Johnson, who was not healthy earlier in the year when Chase Claypool was tearing it up, and he does get his 10th TD today. Chase Claypool having one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time for sure. But is Deontay Johnson almost maybe underrated to you because of what Chase Claypool's doing and because of maybe the injuries earlier in the season? And is there any validity to the thought that the future of the wide receiver corps, with Juju's contract in flux and Chase Claypool, as great as he is, it actually could be a future that Deontay Johnson is the WR1 for this team moving forward?
I think he's certainly underrated, especially because, Claypool's getting all the recognition for the touchdowns and his scoring start. And, he's just caught the league by storm this year. But it's Deontay, especially over the last 2 games, or he's got 200-yard games back-to-back. He's the one getting the nitty-gritty, moving the chains, moving the ball downfield to set up, chasing the other guys to eat. And I definitely think I believe in my heart that Chase Claypool has a very high ceiling, but Deontay is definitely up there too. And I think in the same way they could complement each other down the years. So hypothetically, if Juju does walk, the Steelers could be set in the way that they'll have Claypool to take the top off the defense, and then Deontay to be slippery and work underneath and get those midfield yardage for Ben.
Deontay Johnson just looks like a stud out there, and he really looks healthy now. He had the streak earlier in the year where not only coming off an injury, but it seemed like he had his own personal streak. Every week he was in the tent. He couldn't have a week without – he had a Kyle Ripken streak of being in the tent every week. So it's nice to see him have a couple weeks in a row not dealing with an injury, not even being on anyone's media outlet front page for even mid-game. Deontay Johnson is in the tent, or Deontay Johnson dealing with this injury. He's getting through these weeks without an injury. And yes, Ben's finding whoever's open, but Deontay Johnson is taking advantage of that space. And as much as he created space for Juju maybe last year, which was underrated for him, he's now gaining that advantage in space being created for him this year. So it's really nice to see the Steelers with all these weapons right now, regardless of what the future holds. It doesn't really matter who's the wide receiver one, but for me, with still Juju, the Steelers aren't going to pay tons of money for one guy when they know they can churn these receivers either through the draft or what they have now. So that the only negative I will say is Juju's agent is probably losing this year because they're going to be scared to throw tons of money at Juju when they know they can just churn any receiver out there. That's the only issue, but it doesn't matter for this year. And even if Juju's not there next year because he wants more money or they don't want to worry about paying him tons, Chase Claypool and Deontay Johnson, definitely a great 1-2 punch for you. Any concern tight end wise? Eric Ebron certainly emerged, has had a solid last couple weeks, but this was a game with another injury. We know the Vance McDonald issue. They wanted to go 2 tight end sets most of this year. They've not been able to do it because of personnel and other issues. And as great as Eric Ebron is as a pass catcher, and Derek Watt having issues with this, he's not the greatest blocker. So is that a concern moving forward?
I believe it's a concern, but I think you just got to roll with what your strengths are. And right now the Steelers are having a lot of strengths, like splitting everybody out wide, moving the ball out. If you're looking on Ebron to be a run blocking tight end, then the Steelers are doing something wrong. Exactly.
Right.
They could still always go to 2 tight end sets when Vance comes back and see how that goes. But then again, you're kind of almost showing your cards in a way where now if Vance is on the field, the defenses might be keyed into, okay, we could probably expect a run here because they have the run blocking tight end in. So, but I'm not really too concerned. I think Ebron's doing a good job for what he's asked to do. And once Vance gets back, that's just an added bonus.
I don't think anyone's having more fun outside Ben Roethlisberger than maybe Eric Ebron. I know he's had the rumors of being a problem in past stops, but I will say, I would imagine you can attest, just in terms of media, he's been a joy to deal with. He's smiling every time we talk to him, and he's not lost the game as a Steeler. And now he's producing. He was struggling to find himself in the offense early in the season, but now seemingly he's involved in producing and a major piece for Ben that he hasn't really had since Heath Miller. Daniel Valente of The Score joining me again here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Appreciate all of you here watching along. Feel free to chat along. I do see a couple of you in the chat right now. Not really questions, more statements. I love how Derek Watt closed the gap there. I'm not really sure what he was referring to there. I think he might have meant TJ Watt in terms of how he kind of closed in on Defensive Player of the Year. I think that's definitely possible. TJ Watt's had a great year to this point. And he's also, and then we see another comment here with Jalen Samuels, and I can kind of segue that in, not focusing on Samuels, but James Conner able to do a little bit more in the running game today. He had his games earlier in the season where he was producing. To me, he's still not a featured back, and the running game has been the only issue really for the Steelers offense this season. You don't need the running game when your offense is throwing as well as they've been, but is that a concern for you as the playoffs get closer, the weather gets worse, especially with potentially more COVID concerns and reduced rosters of stars if they happen to contract things, that the Steelers do need to have more of an efficient running game to have the season end in a Super Bowl title than we've seen? Definitely.
I think if you look at any of the past Super Bowl teams, they at least need to be decent running the football. And, if your game plan, if they don't have a running game and your game plan is to just rely on Ben's arm throughout the whole playoffs and put the whole pressure on his arm, I don't think that's a recipe for success, especially if they start running into, like the Kansas Cities of the world and stuff like that. Like you need to kind of keep them off the field as well and pound the rock. And I'm hopeful that James Conner and the running game can get it going. Today was a good first step, like you were saying. But I would like to see them reach where they were at earlier in the year.
Do you think James Conner can do it? Do you think he can be a featured back, or does he need more help with the Anthony McFarlands of the world, even the Jalen Samuels of the world that was mentioned? McFarland able to do it at times, Samuels doing in the past, but the three of them seems to be a better recipe than the one. For me, he's not a featured back, but do you think Conner can do it more than maybe I'm giving him credit?
I don't want to say this is like a knock on Conner, but I believe that he's one of those backs that, defenses aren't typically going to fear and have to put their game plan around. But if everything lines up well for him, the blocking's there, he can consistently produce. Okay. I wouldn't go out and say that he's a featured back or even that it would be a huge loss if he walks after this year. I believe, the Steelers can easily draft a rookie or someone in the first, second round, and fill it in. And that's not even like a knock on Conner. That's just, how the running back position is tailored today too, where they're almost a dime a dozen. But I think Conner could be serviceable down the stretch. And I think he's shown that.
Yeah, I mean, again, James Conner has been better than many would have expected before entering the NFL. I mean, a third-round pick with his great story. I don't think, and I myself included, I didn't think James Conner. I was taking bets actually with a colleague of mine at the Fan when I was hosting shows there and doing even more than I do now there, that he wasn't going to get even the production that he had in his rookie season. So he's well exceed expectations. The only point of it is whether or not he's a featured back, and that might not be necessary to win a championship. You do need a little bit more running game than maybe the Steelers have had in recent weeks, even though these games maybe have not dictated that. Again, Daniel Valente here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Daniel, come at you from the Score. Mike Asti with you here for Steelers Now and PSL. And Daniel, last thing on this game, and this segues into next week easily. It segues into the week after, and I'm going to imagine it's going to segue into Sunday Night Football on a Sunday night against the Buffalo Bills. I'd be shocked if it doesn't segue there in terms of the Steelers' run towards an NFL record. And right now, the Steelers defense continuing their streak of at least one sack in 67 consecutive games. They're looking to tie and then break the record set by the 99 through 2003 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That streak obviously involves more than just this season. That involves more than just these players, but these players are the focus, and these players are creating sack after sack after sack. It was more surprising it took them until the third quarter to get a sack today by Stephon Tuitt to make some fans wipe some sweat off their brow, than for them not to get a sack. That record almost seems guaranteed. It almost appears they're going to shatter that record because it would be astonishing if they wouldn't carry that on the rest of this season. But I do want to ask this. When you have a consecutive streak like that, when you have a pass rush like that, and a record of sacks like that, it's going to put you in rarefied air in NFL history, and they could set the record. Again, the 2003 Buccaneers eventually setting that, and that was capping off a success of 4 years by Tony Dungy and then John Gruden and winning the one championship. We know the 85 Bears, the 2000 Ravens, even the Steelers in their last Super Bowl championship run have been great defenses throughout NFL history and even recent memory. Where does this Steelers defense rank to you in terms of NFL history? And if they win a championship, where do they rank? Because they're not getting the respect of those historic defenses, and I'm not in any way saying they're better than them. Those 2000 Ravens 85 Bear defenses, they got to be 1 and 2 in NFL history. But is there a sense this is almost an underrated bunch throughout the history of the league? Because, again, they're about to have the record, and if they will get a championship with this group, whether it be this year or next year, they will have mirrored what those defenses did. The ones I mentioned only have one title with their group in a 3 or 4 year period, which right now is what the Steelers are potentially looking to do as well.
I think the 85 Bears there, and 2000 Ravens are definitely in the category of their own, especially because if you look at like the 2000 Ravens and like the ability to drag Trent Dilfer to a Super Bowl, it's pretty incredible. But
yeah, true. And the 85 Bears, Miller's not the same thing as Ben
But
Roethlisberger.
There's no doubt that this defense is doing some pretty amazing things. And the fact that, this sack record is what we're sweating about just speaks volumes to just, we assume that every week they're going to take care of the job. And we're talking like we're expecting like multiple sacks a week almost when we watch. Mm-hmm. So I think they could definitely, if we're looking at like 21st century wise, definitely be up there. And then you add a Super Bowl to that potentially, cherry on top. I think you have to give them the respect they deserve and definitely have them somewhere within, I don't know, top 10, top 15 all time, especially because we're talking about the modern era here. So now, the passing offense is taken off compared to those times. And if they can go into the playoffs and withhold that same standard, let's say if they run into a Patrick Mahomes, or let's say they make the Super Bowl and run into another NFC powerhouse and they could put on a similar performance, I definitely think you have to give them that respect.
The Steelers definitely need, fair or unfair, a championship to be in that conversation legitimately. There's been great NFL defenses throughout NFL history, even going back to the Minnesota Vikings of the 1970s. But the reason why people talk about the Steelers defenses of the 70s, even the Cowboys teams of the 70s, because they're the ones that won championships. The Minnesota Vikings got in some, but they didn't win championships. For the Steelers team to really be involved, fair or unfair, and they played great defensively last year, but didn't make the playoffs because of the issues on offense and the injuries, they're going to need to win a championship. But one championship certainly puts them at least in a recent memory conversation. I think it's going to be impossible, like you, to crack that 1-2 with the 85 Bears and 2000 Ravens, because regardless of what the stats say, they are always going to be able to say, we didn't have a Pro Bowler. We didn't even have an average quarterback. We didn't have a Hall of Famer in front of us. Certainly with the Ravens and with Trent Dilfer, we had at the time an average or subpar quarterback who we led all the way. We didn't even score points most of those years, at least touchdowns, and won week after week. And the 85 Bears had a little better than average quarterback maybe that year, but certainly not a dynamic offense. So that's their trump card. But the Steelers defense – it's just astonishing. Yeah, it would be unbelievable if that isn't 70 plus, if not beyond that, or carries over into next year, because it almost was a surprising thing that it was almost feeling like when a pitcher has a no-hitter through 7, you just don't talk about it. You sit away from him. I'm looking there. You're hearing on the broadcast, early third quarter, there's not been a sack. It's like, okay, like there's going to have to be one here soon. You're dominating the game, but you need a sack to continue the streak. It was almost a weirdness that they couldn't break through.
To be honest with you, we had the game up here, and I'm like watching, and I'm like, do the Steelers have a sack yet? Like I haven't seen anything, and I have to double check on the box score, and I'm like, oh my god, they still don't have one. What's going on here? And then it was Tuitt shortly later got one. I was like, okay.
Yeah, right. I mean, that would be ridiculous to lose it to the Jacksonville Jaguars with a young QB and have it not go to the primetime games. Daniel Valente here of The Score, joining us for the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Mike Asti with you here. Not as much in the chat as past week, so I do want to keep it here with Daniel Line. I do want to kind of ask you as we now segue, because it makes sense. I mean, no disrespect to the Jags. They're now 1-9. The Steelers are 10-0. Regardless of what's happened in some of these games, the Steelers again are 10-0, and they sit there vying for that first overall seed. But, Daniel, as you know, they only have that one game leg up on the Chiefs. And while the Chiefs have lost, they certainly are the defending champs and have looked really, really good as well. And the way the playoffs are set up this year, forget the division, which seems to be certainly well in hand based on what's happening even to Baltimore today. You want the number 1 overall seed. You don't even want to be number 2 overall. You want the number 1. They've had seeding issues in recent years where they lost games they should have otherwise won, and they had to go on the road to New England or having to go on the road to Baltimore or Denver in those playoff games. You don't want to have to go into Arrowhead, even if it's only half the stadium or 10K there. You still don't want to have to do that with travel and worrying about COVID and all of those issues. You want to be at home. So it makes that game against Baltimore a big one, to say the least. Thanksgiving night, going to take away a little bit from our holiday here. I'm going to be probably doped up on tryptophan trying to cover that game. But nonetheless, the Steelers will take on the Baltimore Ravens Thursday night football. And not only is it big for the division, it's big for the Steelers in terms of seeding the rest of the way. They did not play well against the Ravens earlier this year, but they won. The Ravens have looked worse since then. What do the Steelers need to do to beat the Ravens? And how has this game maybe changed for you, if at all, from when they played earlier in the season? Because Baltimore has seemingly regressed. The Steelers have improved, but you don't want to make that a trap game either and figure out Baltimore's worse and we're going to take care of business. You never know with those two teams, of course.
Yeah, so I think just like you're saying, these are looking like two teams headed in two different directions, where the Steelers are headed up. The Ravens look like they're kind of on a slope there. The first game, the biggest thing was the Steelers fell behind and they were the ones playing catch up. If you got to, Baltimore's coming into Heinz Field, you got to quote unquote knock them in the mouth. If you can make Lamar Jackson have to pass to win, you're in a position to succeed.
Right.
If the Steelers have to scratch and claw their way out, that's when you keep Lamar honest, you keep that offense honest, and they can attack you in a variety of ways. If they can come out and put a 10-point lead, a 14-point lead, and force Lamar to throw, I think the textbook's out, and that's the key to beat the Ravens this year. We've seen it week after week, and exactly like you were saying too before, don't downplay the competition. Just because the Ravens are down, it's a divisional game. They're coming into this, they want to win. They really need something to improve their outlook on the year. So don't let this be their Super Bowl kind of way. Like, don't let this be their tip-off game for turning it around.
And it's not to say the Ravens are a bad team by any means. I mean, this is a playoff team a year ago. They're certainly still a contender for the playoffs this year, but now sitting with a handful of losses, a overtime loss to Tennessee here today. So I will ask you this as somebody who keeps tabs across the NFL, not just on the Steelers, of course. What's happened to Baltimore? Why do you think the wheels have kind of fell off the wagon here for the Ravens, who were the division champs last year, were the favorite coming into this year, even though some maybe did pick Pittsburgh? But this Ravens team, forget the division, forget the Steelers. The playoffs are not guaranteed if they don't turn this around, which would be a major surprise if this team would somehow miss with 7 seeds as a possibility to even get in.
Yeah, with the Ravens, I think, they had a great year last year, a phenomenal year. And just like every other offense that's had a phenomenal year, you can guarantee that defensive coordinators are going to spend the entire offseason studying every tendency, every inch that you use of that field and how you utilize it. So I think a bit of defense is catching up to the Ravens. Maybe the Ravens aren't adjusting. I know Lamar had that quote a couple weeks ago that they're calling out our plays and stuff like that.
Right.
And so I think also he hasn't taken maybe the step people have expected as a passer this year. There was definitely a step from year 1 to year 2, but this year it just kind of feels like it's almost stagnated, like it's flat. And I think the lack of outside receiving is definitely doing them in as well. They got Marquise Brown, Miles Boykin. They got Des Bryant, who hasn't been relevant in who knows how long. So I think it's a whole combination of things. I still think they're an incredibly talented team, but they have a certain game plan that works for them. And if it doesn't go their way, then they get into a bit of trouble. And I think that's what we're seeing over the last month here.
Yeah, Daniel Valente of the Score here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Make sure you also click subscribe here, bottom of video, while you're watching us, either live or after the fact. Steelers now sit at 10-0 on the year after 27-3 being the score, with a big victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars. But it's all really a conversation about going into next week's game, Thursday night, Thanksgiving night, against the now struggling Baltimore Ravens, who sit at 6-4 while the Steelers are 10-0. And I will also bring this up because it's going to be talked about all week. Lamar Jackson, 17 for 29, under 60% completion percentage, 186, 1 TD, 1 interception, 1 sack, a quarterback rating of 74 in today's game. They lost to Tennessee, who a good team, went to the AFC title game last year, but certainly many probably thought the Ravens would be equal, if not better than them. Do you believe that Lamar Jackson, and we've seen teams figure out kind of quarterbacks like him over the years, and that become a problem for the future, but do you believe Lamar Jackson can be your guy, can be the Ravens guy to lead them to a championship? Or are you starting to have the same doubts maybe as some others that Lamar Jackson has a ceiling that has been figured out, and unless something changes catastrophically within him individually, that he might not be the guy taken to the promised land in today's NFL?
I certainly think he can. I would like to see him with some more help, though. Like I was saying earlier, if I don't know why the Ravens didn't go out and get another outside wide receiver last year. They could definitely use work there. It's pretty much, if Lamar's not hitting Mark Andrews down the middle, it's almost like every ball he's throwing is a contested ball on the outside. So I do believe the book is out on him kind of in a way, and he needs to take certain steps that I think people were expecting, but it's a combination of, well, I want to see him with these tools first before I could say that, because he's a hell of a dynamic player. Anyone who could get it done with their legs and with their arm, it's two threats you gotta defend against. So he has taken a step behind this year, but how much of that comes down to just play calling from Greg Roman or the lack of weapons on the outside, I think that plays a part in it. So I'm not ready to just fully give up on him yet, but
Right.
I certainly have been disappointed by his efforts this year.
Well, when you're an MVP candidate, the franchise is not going to give up on you, and the Ravens are certainly going to go into next season with Lamar Jackson as the starter, regardless of how this season pans out. But I think it is fair to say that there's been an evident ceiling with even Cam Newton eventually, it appears. He had that great run with the Panthers, but it's kind of been a roller coaster ride since, and there's been injuries. We know the story of how RG3 finished. We even know the ceiling of Michael Vick before his scandal. It does appear that style of quarterback has a ceiling that has not necessarily been broken through to be a 10-year, 20-year run to the Hall of Fame yet. So we will see if Lamar can do that. It definitely does also align about the weapons. Marquise Brown, are you surprised he's not been able to be kind of more of an impact player than he's really been? He's had his spots, but in terms of that dynamic playmaker, it appeared coming out of Oklahoma, he could be that guy, but yet going through these recent weeks, it's been Andrews. It's Des Bryant was able to be involved in this game today. And Marquise Brown, he's dealt with injuries, but he's not really been able to be a game changer or a playmaker for the Ravens.
Yeah, he's been really quiet, and I think, that caught me by surprise. Even if you go back to his Oklahoma days, he's taking the top off defenses. He's streaking down the field, and whether it's just because the Ravens offense isn't tailored that way, plus with Lamar's regressions this year, hitting anybody on the outside. He just hasn't been able to put up the numbers. I think he could honestly do well if there's another solid number 1B, receiver there to kind of take some heat away from him, and then we can see what he can do. And that's why I think that if the Ravens had one more outside receiver, which, as someone who watches the Steelers, I'm kind of thankful they don't, but I think if they did, it could be a different ball game. And I want to go back to your point you were saying about how quarterbacks who play that certain style have a certain lifespan. I think that's true to a sense, and I think the biggest key is those quarterbacks have to be able to develop into a pocket passer or use their legs to kind of build their own pocket. And I think we saw that with Russell Wilson throughout his early years.
Right.
It looks like Kyler Murray is somehow on his way to doing that now.
Right.
So that is the biggest key. Where if even if you're not going to be a true pocket passer, you have to be able to escape, create your own pocket, and accurately make those throws down the field.
I think that's perfect. You took my example away from me. Russell Wilson is the guy that early in his career, it felt similar. He wasn't as much of an athlete as or Lamar Jackson. He was a little bit more of a passer then. But he was criticized as, whether it's a false narrative or not, maybe how he looked like them, people assumed that he was going to go down that same path. He became a pocket passer. He became more of a guy who can create his own pocket while being elusive, and he's going to the Hall of Fame. So maybe he is legitimately the ceiling that has broken away from that mold, but everybody else has seemingly reached that peak and then not been able to go further. We will see what Lamar can do, still very early in his career in comparison to, say, Cam. But you'd probably also, if you're the Ravens, are concerned that you didn't think you'd get the dip this quickly. Cam at least had 4 or 5 years before we saw that dip, maybe before he could get to the Hall of Fame level, but we're not even giving Lamar, much time here. It's about 2 years of elite level play, and now it's been a dip most of this season, certainly in big games. So tons of pressure on him, tons of pressure on the Ravens. And I will say this week's going to be a lot of work for Josh Dobbs in practice. It's going to be a short, reduced week of practice. This is why it's nice to have him there on the sideline, despite his relationship with Big Ben and that chemistry, as him almost being a future coach if he doesn't want to become a rocket scientist. But also the fact that he can mirror Lamar a little bit as a runner in practice that, say, a Duck Hodges or even Mason Rudolph cannot do. Rounding things out here with Daniel Valente of The Score here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Daniel, I do want to ask you, obviously the Ravens have been struggling, but it's still a big game and they're still a very, very good team. What are the keys of the game for you? What do the Steelers need to do, aside from just neutralizing the running of Lamar Jackson, which you figure they're going to do? But if the Steelers win, what do you think occurred? And if the Steelers would lose this game, because it's fair to say that the betting odds are on them losing a game this year and not running through this entire season 16-0. This is the best team, or one of, they're going to play the rest of the year. It's not a tough schedule aside from maybe the Buffalo Bills on that Sunday Night Football game where they could set the record defensively. But if they would lose, then what do you think occurred and what did the Ravens do?
I think the keys for the Steelers, number one, don't turn the ball over. It's a rivalry game. You don't want to make it any easier for the opposition. Number two, you got to get out ahead early, like I was saying. Force Lamar to, pass to win. He's got to beat you with his arm, not his legs. Number three, I think they got to stay consistent in their lanes. I think a couple times in the other game, the first game against them, the Steelers weren't consistent in holding their gaps, and it was allowing Lamar and J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards to kind of run wild for a little bit. And that's what really I think might concern me the most is just short week, players are tired, they got a couple days to get ready, and they're facing a team that is a very powerful running threat. So I think if they could stay true to those three things, they should come out in a favorable position. But once again, it's a big divisional game, and both teams are going to bring their best.
They are. You always throw the records out the window with Steelers, Ravens. I know that's what Tomlin and Harbaugh are going to say. And really looking at this schedule, it is astonishing. And again, the Steelers' 10-0 run has not been nearly what the Patriots' run to 16-0 was when they were dominating and winning every game by 20 points and winning every game except for the Super Bowl, except for a close game loss there to the Giants, who kind of gave them a fluke loss that season to ruin what to me is the best team of all time. But honestly, I mean, even great Steelers teams of the past, they've not been able to do this. When the Steelers went 15-1 with Big Ben his first year, they had that loss early with Tommy Maddox, and then were able to go on the big run with Big Ben. So this is astonishing. They managed to win some games otherwise they would have lost in past years, and have some luck lead them to these victories as well. So 10-0, going to that Thursday night Thanksgiving matchup with the Ravens, then the Washington football team, who have just been a mess most of this year despite some bright spots in there, and Alex Smith and that story of him starting. The Bills and Josh Allen, that's a good team. That's the night for the record. That offense and Josh Allen being so elusive, by the way, Daniel, I think you would agree with this. While that record seems guaranteed, that's the only real issue. He could get away enough from the pocket to avoid a sack. So that, as well as Lamar. Yeah. So that's another great team they're playing. But then it's Cincinnati, Indy, and Cleveland. Figuring they're not going to, whether or not they rest players, and they might do that if they have the number one seed locked up. But it's hard not to go for being undefeated, even though Tomlin wants the Super Bowl more than that. Is there a loss here? I mean, is it the Ravens and Buffalo or bust? This just is crazy to think this team could finish this year 16-0 in the regular season. But this is a favorable schedule the rest of the way.
So I think you're definitely spot on where the Ravens and the Bills, those are going to be some tough games. Josh Allen kind of reminds me of a young Ben Roethlisberger at times, where he's just like completely wild. You never know what you're going to get, but he has the ability to change momentum and change the tune of the game on a dime. The Indianapolis matchup, for some reason, has my curiosity. Okay. I believe they're a good team as well. Rivers is obviously, I wouldn't put him in the same category as Ben right now, but I am a big fan of the Indy defense. I believe that they have a playmaker at every level. You got Buckner on the D-line, Darius Leonard at linebacker, Julian Blackman at safety. I think that won't be a cakewalk either, but depending on if they are resting starters, I believe that is week 16. Who knows? But I think those are the three games you've got to circle. If they can get by those, who knows? Anything's possible. Maybe even 16-0.
It just seems like everything that's gone on here in 2020, and this team has had to deal with the game being postponed, which they ended up winning. They've had to deal with players testing positive. They had to deal with, and we don't know this yet. We'll find out tomorrow, as annoying as the NFL policy is. They've had to deal with players testing positive and playing games, which, again, we'll find out tomorrow who tested positive from this game, as much as that's just you want to, hit your head against the wall there for the way that's going on with the NFL this year. But yet they still sit at 10-0 right now, despite letting Denver hang around, letting Philly hang around, playing so bad against Dallas, even issues against Baltimore. They are, and a slow start to the Jaguars despite a big win. They are 10-0, and that's just insane. Baltimore obviously could be a tough game. Buffalo, I do like your Indy selection, just also because Philip Rivers knows the Steelers defense so well. But his recent history against the Steelers defense is not one to success. So maybe they could feast up on him. I don't know. It's going to absolutely be interesting, to say the least. I guess just, finally here, any thoughts on the Steelers as a contender for the Super Bowl? Because we talked weeks ago where I think you had them top 5 among elite teams. They were undefeated then, but they hadn't really played a quality opponent yet. That cannot be said now. They certainly have played quality opponents. They're the only undefeated team, but that's not what I'm asking here, because the Chiefs are the defending champs. They only lost to what now appears to be a playoff team. They've been winning. The Ravens have fell off a little bit. The other teams, the Bills, have still looked good. Indy, New England's even been better than before, but they're certainly not what they used to be by any means. It's not loaded with depth. Tennessee is in there. Certainly we can go to the NFC teams as well, with Seattle, with LA, etc., with Arizona even. Where do the Steelers fall amongst the NFL elite teams? And for you, now sitting at 10-0, is it Super Bowl or bust? At least Super Bowl appearance. Can they fail to reach the Super Bowl and have this be a successful year? As much as that sucks to say, and as hard as that is, when you're 10-0, that is going to be set. Can they have a successful year that is shy of the Super Bowl? And where do they fall right now for you amongst teams that are Super Bowl favorites in the league?
I think it's definitely almost Super Bowl or bust. I think you have to look at it that way, just considering the circumstances of 10-0, Ben's got a couple years left, the upcoming contract situations of a lot of these top guys. This year's your window. Next year you have a bit more of that window, but that's really it. So I think it definitely is Super Bowl or bust this year. Where I'm going to rank them among the contenders, I definitely think they could give the Chiefs a fight. They could certainly beat them. What they can do is they can get pass rush with 4. And I mentioned previously when I was on with you, how important that is to stopping Mahomes. If you got to send the house and leave guys in coverage, if you can't get home, he's going to pick you apart.
Right.
But if you can get pass rush with 4 and get pressure with 4, you're in for a good position. And I would feel even more confident if that game's at Heinz Field and they can hold on to a number 1 seed. So I think that'll definitely be the game or the matchup to watch. I hate getting too overly eager about it, because I'm just having shades of 2017 come up where, they're in position to get number 1, and then something happens the last couple of weeks. All of a sudden we got Jacksonville coming in and, we blow it or stuff like that. But I definitely think that it's a Super Bowl or bust year, especially just considering everything. And going back to their undefeated record, I just wanted to touch on this.
Sure.
Sure, they're not blowing out teams, by 20 points like the Patriots and stuff. But I still do think there is quite a bit to say about the adversity that this team has faced, and the fact that they are still here 10-0. Even if you go back to 2008 or those other good years with the Steelers, Ben had 4 or 5 game-winning drives those years. So not every game was a cakewalk. They did have to come back at the end. And just the fact they were able to, all the questions about Ben's health, his elbow. Can Juju be a number 1? Can Connor stay healthy? No bye week, the COVID situation, Ben not practicing. And they week after week, they're able to win. I think there's something to say about that too.
And you didn't even mention the drama of 2 years ago and the contract issues of TJ, of Connor, of Juju headed into this season. Again, having to deal with the first NFL game being postponed, having every week it seems like somebody else tests positive and not sure whether or not they're going to play, and then Tomlin getting criticized for playing guys that are quote-unquote sick. Every drama that could possibly occur. I know when I've appeared on anybody else's show over the years, I feel like a psychologist. They're asking me, well, what is this player thinking? What is Antonio Brown thinking? It's like I'm a journalist, not a psychologist. So it's finally about football for this team, but it's also been about so much else. So to overcome the adversity, and there's absolutely been some around the Steelers more than anybody else potentially, to be 10-0 is astonishing regardless of how you get there. That is the most important thing. So, yeah, I agree. What do you think is going on after that, though? Chiefs, Steelers, 1-2, no matter how you slice them. Who's your 3, 4, 5?
In just the AFC or just in the NFL in general?
Both.
AFC, honestly, I'm putting the Colts at number 3, then the Bills. Number 5.
I'm a Rivers guy, so I hope he can have a run.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
Number 5 in the AFC. Let's see here. I do like the Raiders. I really like what Gruden's doing there. I don't know if I would put them at number 5. But I do like the Raiders. The Titans are there. The Ravens. I think there's a bunch of teams fighting for that 5 spot in the NFL. So you got Steelers, Chiefs up there. Tampa Bay. They trip over their own feet sometimes, but I believe they're legit. Packers, same thing. There's something to be said about what the Saints are pulling off. Where same thing every week. They have some different adversity, whether it's Michael Thomas being out, Michael Thomas being disciplined, Drew Brees injured, such and such, and they just keep stringing off wins, and I think there's said about that too. So I think those are definitely my top 5. Seattle's just right outside that. Russell Wilson, the same thing, had a rough few weeks, but he's been killing it this year. I think if that defense, that's the only real concern I have with them. But those are definitely my top 5 to 6 in the NFL.
Weird to say the only concern is for the Seahawks defense when they won that championship.
I know.
With the concern for the offense and the defense being so great all year. So it is really a tale of 2 careers almost for Russell Wilson. That documentary that's put together one of these years, maybe you guys will do it, is going to be a very bizarre, maybe going to be a bizarre twist of a decade for Russell Wilson. Underrated with the defense carrying him maybe, and then an MVP type of career with the defense not getting it done enough and maybe not enough weapons around him. So we will see. I think that's a great, a solid top 10, whether it's just AFC or around the NFL. The Steelers are certainly right there, certainly at the top of the heap. And if we're doing a college football type of ranking, that loss for the Chiefs doesn't look too bad anymore, does it? So that's a quality loss right now. And if the Steelers would go ahead and lay one of these eggs, that'd be very similar in terms of how they're thought of. They are the defending champs for a reason. So I think you said it before. To be the man, you got to beat the man. To be the best, you got to beat the best. So that's still the case with the Kansas City Chiefs right now as the defending champs. But you cannot look ahead to that game as that's not guaranteed yet by any means. But it is now another Steelers-Ravens week amongst the Pittsburgh parts as the Steelers sit at 10-0 heading into that game. The Ravens down and out a little bit, losing in overtime to another quality team, the Tennessee Titans, but a team the Steelers have already beat as they are now 6-4. So, Daniel, I definitely appreciate the time, man. We'll possibly talk to you again here before the season closes out. I definitely appreciate you and the score loaning you to me here for these post-game shows a couple times this year. But the Steelers sit at 10-0. The Pittsburgh Steelers are 10-0, which is the most important thing for sure, as this Steelers team now continues an undefeated season, which sounds amazing to say. The history of this franchise, the success, the Lombardi trophies, the 6 that they have, the Steel Curtain era, all of those teams, none of those teams started an NFL season 10-0. And this 2020 Steelers team, with all the adversity of recent years, all the adversity of this individual season that we touched on, sits at 10-0. Might not be the most impressive 10-0. Might not be as impressive as other teams even playing this year. They might not even be number 1 in your power ranking. That might still be the Chiefs. But nonetheless, they're 10-0. They're in the driver's seat for the number 1 overall seed. It's critical to get the number 1 overall seed, though, and that is in no way guaranteed. This Ravens game coming up on Thanksgiving, and then, of course, the Bills, the Colts. Those are the games to watch out for the rest of the way. It sounds crazy to think they could finish 16-0. but anything is possible in 2020, and I didn't think they would get to 10-0. So the Steelers sit at 10-0 after a 27-3 victory over the lowly Jacksonville Jaguars, who, again, I will leave the conversation whether or not they should be in Jacksonville and whether or not London's viable over there on Twitter. But nonetheless, the Jags team that's 1-9, just losing game after game after beating the Colts to open up the year oddly, and not able to handle the Steelers by any means. The Steelers winning 27-3 on the day in North Florida. The Steelers now 10-0 on the year. They come back home, come back to Pittsburgh, and host the Baltimore Ravens on Thanksgiving night as they look to continue their undefeated streak and also look to continue a historic streak with a sack in a game, because having at least one sack in a game now stands at 67 in a row, and that streak could be broken. That NFL record could be set against the Buffalo Bills on Sunday Night Football in only a handful of weeks. For Daniel Valente of The Score, thanks to him and The Score again for loaning them out to me during some of these post-game shows this year for all of us throughout the Now family of networks. I also want to give an apology from what I see there on the chat. I don't know if there was an issue with YouTube or what. I do see that notifications apparently weren't working for this show, which is why we didn't get as much chat activity as Matt and I have been fortunate to get over recent weeks. And even when I was here on my own, getting tons of chat activity. I thought maybe it was just the Jaguar game didn't mean much, and we're going to do Steelers previews before the Ravens even after this. And that game will be what to look out for. I'm imagining Thanksgiving night, we're going to get some activity, even if after the holiday and all of you are passed out on your couch while trying to talk to us here on the YouTube live. So we apologize for that if that's the case. If you didn't get notifications because YouTube messed up, we certainly apologize for that here in this post-game show. But again, for all of us throughout the Now family of networks, for Pittsburgh Sports Live, for Daniel Valente of The Score, I'm Mike Asti. And again, it's not been perfect. It's not been perfect. It's not even always been impressive, even though it was impressive today. It certainly was impressive last week, and it's getting more impressive as the weeks go by. But nonetheless, the most important thing exists. The Pittsburgh Steelers sit at 10-0 for the first time in franchise history, the illustrious history of this franchise, and they now head home to take on the Baltimore Ravens, who are struggling, headed into another Steelers-Ravens week, this one on a holiday, on Thanksgiving night, looking to move to 11-0 and looking to continue their path to what now appears certainly to be championship or bust.